Okay, and that was true of the 19th century too. There are these laws of motion that keep, reappearing no matter where you look. And that's one of them, that immigration is always more volatile than the economic conditions that produce it in the host countries. Okay, so what happens, however, when both the sending and the receiving region are undergoing bad economic times? Which dominates? Things are bad at home, I want to get away from it, but things are bad abroad, which dominates in influencing the move? And the answer is always conditions in the host country will dominate, always. Conditions in the sending nation, unless it's, ethnic cleansing or something, but economic conditions at home will have much smaller impact than conditions in the receiving country. So how big are those effects? Well, when you do the econometrics for the 19th century, that is up to World War I, basically on a downturn, for every 100 jobs lost in the US, 10 migrants don't come. So that's where the 10% rule comes from. And that, by the way, is lucky for us, for America, and for American workers, because that means the unemployment rate would be even higher if the immigrants stayed and competed with the natives. But instead, they have, they're more sensible. They go home and wait it out, until the bad times are over. That makes it easier for Native Americans to retain their jobs. They have fewer people to compete for the diminished jobs. But anyway, so there's this 10% rule. For every 100, you get 10 less immigrants. So let's look at the evidence more recently, at least up to 2004, and that's what it looks like. What's that? Well, you've got the handout, and if I walk up close, I can see those three labels, but there is the gross movements across the US border, net inflows, so all those are positive numbers, of course. There's the plot of the net flows, and correlate that red line with that one, which is the unemployment rate. You say, you eyeball that, and I say, wow, I mean, that's got to be a positive correlation for sure. And you do more than eyeball it, you do the econometrics on it, and you get the same result that you get for the 19th century. You get this 10% rule. For every 100 jobs lost in the receiving country, 10 immigrants don't come. Now that means either 10 Filipinos in the US go home, or it might be 10 Filipinos who wanted to come, don't come. Either of those could be driving that result. Anyway, that's what the 10% rule is, which has very important implications for the present and the future. Because if it's, as a lot of people predict, that the steady state growth rate in the US and the EU is going to settle down to a lower level in the future, by 3 decades hence. We also think there will be more volatility around that level. In the past, since World War II, with miracle growth rates in Europe and the US, being a powerhouse pumping along, variations around it with shocks are pretty trivial when you have a very high rate of growth on the trend line. When you don't, those shocks begin to look more serious. And that 10% rule is going to play a role for immigrants. That's one reason why we might want to pay attention to it. Just said all that. So anyway, so the question is whether that news about the likely future of immigration and out-migration from places like the Philippines and Kerala and the Baltics and Mexico and so on, whether the 10% rule and instability and slower growth will be reinforced by supply-side conditions in the source countries. The answer I'm going to give you, they sure are. And in fact, they're the most powerful force at work in dictating the magnitudes of migration. Okay, so that's what I want to focus on, and this crazy assertion that then immigration is going to dry up, at least the migration from the present third world to the high-income European, North American countries. It may be a different matter, of course, on describing migrations within what we call the South or within the third world itself. It may be that migrations between the Philippines and India and China will take up the slack if the 10% rule applies to the higher wage regions. Anyway, I said this once when I was focusing on demographic issues. There are these immigration life cycles out there in the data. And they're really powerful, and it's those immigration life cycles that's driving my prediction that we're on the downside generally on outmigration from the third world. And I'll give you reasons why that is so, but first I have to show you the facts, whether that's true or false. I think I just said that. So here's an example from data aggregated up. Philippines is in there, so this is Asia and the Middle East all aggregated up. And the bar charts gives you the frequency of migration. Now all these numbers are in rates. They're not a head count, they're in rates. That is relative to the population at the source. That is, what proportion of Filipinos in the year 2011 are exiting and going to the US. Those are the numbers we are counting. But for Asia and the Middle East, you can see that big spike in the early 80s, and it's been downhill ever since. Those rates have declined pretty sharply. That line is what you get when you do the econometrics and summarize the data in that way. And they both say the same thing. You get this inverted U, this kind of life cycle then, a rising rate of outmigration, leveling off, and then a decline in more recent years. This isn't the only part of the world where you see that. Here it is for Latin America. Same spike, this time in the late 80s maybe, but it undergoes the same inverted U. The peak has already been passed and we're on the downside, again on rates of migration. And here's the only part of the world that's an exception to the rule, and that's Africa. Africa looks like, the way I've plotted it here, it looks like it's going up the upside. It's lagging behind everybody else. It's going up the upside, and one can predict it's going to reach a peak and come down the other side sometime in the future. But they're not yet any more than halfway through their inverted U. So there is plenty of evidence of this inverted U out there, this life cycle. And if you disaggregate this evidence and look country by country, you'll see it there too in all the disaggregated data. Okay, so those facts, those are real facts. They suggest two questions and then this aside. And the first question is, okay, what accounts for those life cycles in outmigration rates? That's question number one. Well, one of them may be changing policy in the host countries. No, that will not work. Changing policy in the host countries will not do the trick. More restrictive policy is not explaining the shared decline in all regions and all countries, and the dating is different for different countries. So policy, changing policy in host countries won't explain it. Of course, if all the host countries all of a sudden decide to reduce their quotas, increase their restrictions all at one time, then of course it'll have an impact. But the fact is, that's not what happened, and therefore is not a driving force. So no, that's not one. What about changing labor market conditions in the host countries? Well, sure, that's likely to play a role in that there's been a slowdown of growth in the major high-wage countries, since the big boom of the 70s and spilling over into the 80s or so, and not great lately. So that might possibly be part of the explanation. But I think the big explanation are changing conditions facing potential immigrants in the sending countries. That's, I'm going to argue, with doing most of the work. And once you've done all that work, can you use it to project the future? Well, sure, anybody can project the future. That's easy. And so we will do that and see what it implies. Of course, those conditions of the past may change, and it will change the projections. But if they don't, then the projections will be useful. So we'll look at them. The aside. I think most people think that the Marcos immigration policies that are still in place, as far as I know, really mattered in accounting for the out-migration rates in the Philippines. I believe that's not true. But in any case, that there are other more fundamental factors at work that are pushing the immigrants out. And if the Philippines looks unusual, it's because of that, not because of Marcos's policies. But in any case, that proposition has not been tested. Somebody should be working, somebody in the room should be working on that to assess this assertion that Marcos's immigration policies mattered to the out-migration. Okay, so let me do what I usually do, and then let's first look at the 19th century before we turn to the 20th and the 21st century. So let's look at these. I showed this in a previous lecture, but maybe you weren't here. Maybe you forgot. Maybe you didn't pay attention. So I'll do it again. So here's a characterization first given to describe some Scandinavian country. I can't remember which, but it's a guy named Ackerman. He's obviously a Scandinavian, so must be talking about the Danes or somebody. But anyway, that was a characterization that he viewed immigration to obey those laws of motion, chopped off by World War I, 1915, and gave labels to it: the growth phase, the saturation phase, and then the regression phase. The game starts off in the middle of the 19th century, where this poor country, which is just beginning to have modern economic growth and industrial revolutions. This is Serbia or Portugal. And as soon as growth quickens, where there's some industrialization and some creation of better jobs in the cities, rural migrants come in and grab them. And also some will start to exit. So this first bit, that upward rise, can't be explained by conventional economics, right? Conditions are improving at home in Portugal and Serbia and Russia and so on. Things are improving at home, but more and more young adults are leaving. You'd think more and more would stay home if there are more good jobs at home. Yeah, there are better good jobs at home. Those good jobs at home give households more resources, better incomes, and they use them to invest in themselves. And one of the things they invest in is send the first child abroad to the high-wage area. They can now have enough resources to invest in one of those moves. So that's one of the reasons you have this upswing in out-migration, reaches a peak, and then you get the downside. And the downside is the more conventional economics. And finally, you reach a stage of development where things keep improving at home, then more and more kids stay home. We finally reached that phase.